Hello, Whitney. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
Lindsay, I'm wonderful. I'm delighted to be here.
Me too. I'm excited to have you on the show. So, I'm going to start by letting our listeners know your bio, and then we'll go ahead and get right into our conversation. So, listeners, today on the show, I have Whitney Johnson. Whitney is the CEO and co founder of Disruption Advisors, a world class leadership development company that helps organizations operationalize a growth mindset in their leaders and teams. And Johnson was named by Thinkers 50 as one of the top 10 leading business thinkers in the world in 2021, a top 200 female founder by Inc. magazine in 2023, and in 2020, she was a top voice on LinkedIn, where she has 1.8 million followers. Welcome again, Whitney. We are honored to have you on the show.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Yeah, no, this is great. I am really excited today to dive into the concept of disrupting yourself. So when I say that word, disrupt yourself, what comes to mind? What does this mean to you?
Well, sometimes when people hear disrupt yourself, they're like, is this a bad thing? Is this a good
Right.
thing? It's a good thing. So I'll just say that up front. So
Okay.
when you disrupt yourself, what are you doing? It's a deliberate process of self innovation. It's a decision to build new neural pathways to rewire your brain. And the genesis of this is that I had the privilege of working with Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School for the better part of a decade. And he talked about this term of disruptive innovation, was very focused on products and services and companies and countries. And I had this aha that organizations don't disrupt,
Mm-hmm.
people do. And the only way then your organization or anything in the world can make progress is if we as individuals are willing to disrupt ourselves.
Yes. I love
That's
that.
what it is.
That's what it is. So progress only comes through disruption. So it sounds like change. I mean, sometimes
Mhm.
change happens. We don't have a choice. It's just one day things have changed, right? And then sometimes we go and create that change. How important is that for our own personal growth? Because today we're going in the direction of, living abroad, moving abroad, working abroad, and what that does. How important is change as a catalyst for personal growth, Whitney? What do you think?
Well, I think it is about as important as it gets. So, one of the things that happens is that oftentimes change happens to us. And this is what happened during the pandemic, change happened to us. And the
Yeah.
only way that we were going to be able to navigate through that or navigate through anything else is if we ourselves were willing to change. So, the disruption happened to us. We navigate through it by disrupting ourselves.
Yes.
If you think about this idea of living abroad, something that I think is fascinating. So I've been running a podcast for almost 8 years, and I
Mhm.
over index on immigrants.
Okay. Mhm.
Why do I over index on immigrants?
J tell us what that means for 1 second, Whitney. Just tell us what over-index means, just for our
Oh,
listeners to make
thank
sure
you.
we're dialed in there. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, sorry. It's my
That's
stock
okay.
analyst background. I love how you're like, let's translate this, Whitney. Okay, so what it means is that if you look at the percentage of people that are sort of English speakers in the United States, for
Mm.
example,
Mhm.
so many of the people that I would have on the podcast as a percentage of who I might have are
Mhm.
people who are first or second generation people to the United States.
Okay,
And so I
perfect.
started thinking, well, why is that? Why
Mm.
why has that happened? And I realized, oh, it's because when you move to another country, you're
Mhm.
disrupting yourself. You are
Yes.
building a muscle. We're not just talking like I'm going to take a walk around the block. We're
Sure.
talking about a marathon. We're talking about an Ironman triathlon of
Yes.
completely uprooting yourself, living in a different country, learning a new language. And
Mhm.
so that muscle of being able to disrupt yourself and build those new neural pathways becomes very well developed. And so what
Mm.
I would say is that when you make a decision to live or study abroad, you're disrupting yourself and you're
Yes.
building that muscle.
100%. And maybe that, as you're saying, builds the muscle like we're going to the gym. Then we're able to go take the next challenge, right?
Mhm.
Which is how many people ended up on your show as creating great work, I imagine,
Exactly.
right? Creating something
Exactly.
amazing in the world. I
Mhm.
love that. Well, before
Mhm.
we get further into this topic, I'm super excited to get into it more. I want to make sure our listeners know this is part one of a two-part series about what it means to disrupt yourself. So, part two, guys, is going to be over on my friend Matt Abraham's podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smart, where he is going to explore another angle on the concept of disrupting yourself. So
Mhm.
after this episode or in the next couple of weeks, go over and find that episode over on Think Fast, Talk Smart. So let's dig in a little bit into your personal experience,
Mhm.
Whitney. I know I've heard that you did live abroad. Tell us where you lived. Tell us a little
Mhm.
bit about that experience, your transition experience to living
Mm.
abroad.
Mm. Yeah. So coincidentally, I was born in Spain because my parents they decided to live abroad for a few months, and I only lived there until I was 6 months. But it always primed me of thinking
Yeah.
I'm Spanish. I'm not Spanish, but I thought I was Spanish. So I always studied Spanish in school. But then when I was 21 years old, I had the opportunity to go live in Uruguay as a missionary for 18 months. And I will tell you, even though I had studied Spanish in school, even though I spent 2 months preparing
Yeah.
to go to Uruguay or Uruguay, however you want to say it,
Mhm.
it was so hard the
Yeah.
first couple of weeks there, the first couple of months there, because
Yeah.
I had studied Spanish. And so I could sort of say, ¿cómo estás? Et cetera, et cetera. But I couldn't understand what people were saying.
Mm.
I had no idea what they were saying. And so I remember feeling definitely very homesick because I'm 21 years old and I'm far away from home and I'm going
Oh,
to be
yeah.
here for 18 months. Like I am committed. We're not going home. We're here
Right.
for 18 months. And I remember I actually have this memory of being in someone's home.
Mhm.
They were serving us lunch and they were talking the entire time and I couldn't say a word really.
Oh.
I couldn't understand what they were saying at all. And I remember thinking, I think I just need to smile because it was the only way I could communicate that I was happy to be here. And so while this was a very difficult experience, I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to learn.
Mm.
I'm going to smile. I've got to use my body to communicate that I'm happy to be here talking to these people. I
Yeah.
also need to figure out how am I going to learn this language? How am I going to understand this language? And
Mm.
perhaps most importantly, how am I going to figure out how to love and
Yeah.
love the people that I'm with so that I
Mm.
feel connected to them and not removing myself or disconnecting myself because I feel uncomfortable. But that's what it
Mm.
was like at first.
Yeah, I love that you were already saying, look, you're grasping for things immediately. What
Yeah.
can I do to get a foothold here? What can I do to feel my feet on the ground? What
Mhm.
would be the first few steps? And that you decide, it sounds like you made an important decision, though, Winnie, in that moment to engage, to do
Mm.
what you could to engage. Many people do when they go abroad, they do kind of disconnect a little bit just
Mhm.
because it is hard, it is intense. But if we understand what we're going through, maybe even through a framework. For example, I think now we're going to talk a little bit about the S curve framework and how that might play into life
Yeah.
abroad. I mean, I know exactly what you're saying, Whitney. I spent a semester abroad in Paris, and I had a similar experience, feeling
Mhm.
so disconnected, and lived
Mhm.
abroad in Latin America for a year. So I know exactly, and our listeners do too. So I
Mhm.
think our listeners are going to really resonate with what we're talking about today. Can you tell us a little bit about your framework of the S
Mhm.
curve and how it could relate to the stages where you started kind of grasping for what you could
Yeah.
do and how you move through adjusting to life abroad and how this could
Yeah.
maybe help our listeners if they're living abroad?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So the S-curve framework is it's a framework that helps you understand what does growth look like,
Hmm.
and more importantly, what does it feel like?
Mm.
There's a lot of theory behind it, which I won't go into today, but here's the framework itself. There are three major parts. There's the launch point, there's a sweet spot, and there's mastery. So at the launch point, you've just arrived in a new country.
Okay.
What experience are you having? Well, your brain is running a predictive model. Most of your predictions are inaccurate. And so
Right.
dopamine, that chemical messenger of delight, it
Hmm.
drops.
Okay.
You're thrilled that you're here, but there's a piece of you that says, I am terrified. I am uncomfortable. I
Yeah.
am afraid. I am impatient. I feel like I'm an imposter. This was not a good idea. What's fascinating though, Lindsay, is at this point, growth is happening really, really quickly.
Yeah.
Mathematically, it's happening really quickly. But
Right.
because it's not apparent, it's not yet obvious, it feels slow. It feels like a slog. But
Right.
then once you know that, you're like, okay, this is how it's supposed to feel. This is what it's supposed to look like. You can
Right.
talk yourself through any new situation because you can say, I'm uncomfortable right now. Doesn't mean I'm never going to be comfortable. It just
Mhm.
means I'm uncomfortable right now. I'm doing something new. Situation normal.
Yeah, so we get used to what it feels like to be uncomfortable, and that's kind of the muscle that you mentioned, I think. And when you say we're running our brains are running a predictive model, do you
Yeah.
mean that we're bringing our predictions of what it should look like to get off a plane in New York City, our home country, for example?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by that? And you're not
Yeah, so
finding
when I
what
say
you
predictive
predict?
model, thank
Mhm.
you again for reminding me. It's so funny that you said this because I know a lot of people that are listening to your podcast are non-native English speakers. And recently I was working with a company and one of the people said, who's Italian, who's working in English, he's like, you have to remember that you need to not everybody's a native English speaker, or not everybody's a native
Mhm.
speaker to what you are doing. So I really appreciate your reminding me. Okay,
Sure.
explain what you mean when you say this. So when I say running a predictive model, I mean your brain is doing this thing of saying, like you said, here's what it's going to be like when I get off the plane. Here's what it's going to be like when I go and talk to someone for the first time in Spanish or try to listen to them in Spanish. Here's what
Okay.
it's going to look like where I live. Here's what my daily routine is going to look like. So your brain has all sorts of assumptions or predictions of what it's going to look like and what it's going to feel like when you go to a new place.
Got it.
And
Okay.
of course they're going to be wrong. Like of
Yes.
course they're going to be wrong. And so because they're wrong, that chemical messenger, so that sort of chemical reaction in your brain, the dopamine, it drops and that's why you feel frustrated and discouraged.
Mhm, kinda sense
So
of
so
disappointment.
that's
Yeah. Mhm.
exactly. So that's the launch point. But
Okay.
then if you stay with it, you're like, you don't go home. You're like, you don't turn back around. You stay with it. Then you
Mhm.
tip into the sweet spot. And depending on, where you are and what you're doing, you can tip into the sweet spot faster or slower. But here's what it looks like here. You start to have this experience of those predictions you're making about what it's going to look like. They start to get more accurate because you've now been
Mm.
there for a while and you're like, oh,
Right.
yeah, I know what's going to happen when I turn this corner. And I think I'm going to understand better what this person's saying. And
Mhm.
so they get more accurate. And so now your dopamine starts to spike because they're not only
Mm.
more accurate, sometimes you're going to beat your predictions. You're going to beat
Yes.
your expectations. And so you have these emotional upside surprises. And so the experience that you then have is like, this is exhilarating. And the
Yes.
growth that you're experiencing is not only fast, it feels fast. And you're like, this Paris,
Mm.
this is
Mhm.
where I was supposed to be my entire life.
Right.
I love
Yes.
it. That's the
Yeah.
sweet spot.
That's the sweet spot. And that's mastery too? That's as we is that the point where I mean,
Mm.
I guess there are different
This is
levels
the
of
yeah, so
mastery, of
there's
course.
launch
Mhm.
point, and this is
Mhm.
the sweet spot. Now,
Okay.
mastery, the top of the curve is in a really interesting place
Okay.
because on the one hand, your predictive model, that model of what's going to happen is working.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
on the other hand, there's this piece of you that says, you know what, I came to do what I meant to do. I'm
Okay.
finished. The
Okay.
model works. I've
Okay.
figured it out.
Mm.
It's now my identity shift has taken place. I'm now
Mhm.
sort of at this status quo place. So I'm
Got
still
it.
growing, but not very much. And
Okay.
so part of you has this dilemma because you kind of like being exactly where you are. So that's where you are before you decide to go abroad at the top of that
Mhm.
curve. I kind of like
Mhm.
this. This is really comfortable. I know everything that I'm supposed to do.
Yep.
But your brain needs more dopamine. And so
I
you make a decision to go home or go somewhere new
go
or move to
somewhere
a new
new.
city or take on something new. So that's where that model works. So a very simple way to remember it and to navigate
Mhm.
doing something new is first it's going to feel slow and
Yep.
hard, and then it's going to feel fast and
Mhm.
fun, and then it's going to feel slow, and you're going to have this experience of there's more for me to do on this planet. I
Got
need to
it.
jump to a new S curve.
Oh, fascinating. Would you say that sweet spot is similar to the concept of flow that we've
Absolutely,
heard about? Okay,
for
so it's
sure.
when we're just challenged enough right?
Mhm.
We're just challenged enough that there is some level of mastery already. We're moving into it, getting closer to what you mentioned as that third step
Right.
of mastery. It's the, I also see parallels here to language learning. Many of our listeners,
Mhm.
and I'm sure you experience that too, once you hit that intermediate level, you're having conversations, you're achieving human connection, which on this show
Correct.
is what we talk about every day. It's what really matters. But at some point, we need to really start to push ourselves, move on to that next
Yeah.
challenge. And it,
Yeah.
it can be, I mean, what do you think about that, Whitney? How do we then push ourselves into that next challenge? Because it can be possible to just
Yeah.
ghost at that
Yeah,
point.
so, and I love that you just reminded me. So, I'm in Uruguay for 6 months, and I'm speaking Spanish a lot of the time and hearing a lot of it, but I'm also living with English speakers. So I
Mm,
have a respite.
yeah.
But 6 months in,
Mm-hmm.
I moved to an area and no one
Yeah.
speaks English. It
Yeah.
is all Spanish all the time.
Phew.
And for the first couple weeks it was hard. But then, actually, I'm going to get emotional. And I bet you a lot of your listeners have this experience. But then I was thinking and speaking everything in Spanish, and it was magical. And you know what was especially magical about it is that I became a different person when I spoke Spanish.
Yes.
And I
How
bet that
so?
happens because I came more alive.
Yeah.
Before I went to, because that is a language. And so it's, whatever language you're speaking, it's going to be something different. But to
Mm-hmm.
go from being a native English speaker who
Mm-hmm.
people would describe as being serious to
Right.
speaking Spanish that is so
Yes.
full of emotion and
Mm.
so alive, I felt a piece of myself come alive when
Hmm.
I spoke that language. And that was beautiful.
I love that. I love that we can find different versions of ourselves in different languages, in different living contexts, living in different countries based on who we're connecting with and where we are.
Yeah.
I love that. That is so good. I've always felt the same way when I speak Spanish. There is a different personality that comes out, and we can play around with that. We can have fun with that,
Mhm.
right? That
Mhm.
is so good. That is so
Mhm.
good. And so, as kind of a final question, thank you for walking us through this S curve, Whitney. What would you say for someone who is at, they're in those first few weeks or few hours, whatever it is, and they haven't quite found their footing yet. They're still in that
Mhm.
moment of the dopamine is dropping. What would you say to them to stick with it? Because maybe
Yeah.
there is a temptation to turn back around or try another country, another place, another
Mhm.
party, right? Like it could be
Yeah.
many contexts. What would you say to them?
Yeah.
Stick with it because it is going to get better. It's going to get easier.
Well, I would say 2 things, Lindsay. So sometimes it doesn't make sense to stick with it. So I think we need to open up that, possibility. Sometimes it is
Yeah.
not the right S curve, but
Mm.
let's have the supposition, or not supposition. Let's assume that you really felt good about this decision. Everybody that you love felt like this is a good decision for you to do this. So
Mhm. Yeah.
before you jumped, right? But when you were on the top of that one S curve and you jumped to this new one, you
Mhm.
felt really good about the decision. The people that you love felt good about the decision. It was a good decision for you. What I would say is, tell yourself, well, how long did I say that I would do this? Great.
Mhm. Mhm.
I said I would do it for for 6 months.
Yeah.
I'm going to stick this out until it doesn't feel quite so hard anymore.
Okay.
And so it might be 2 months, it might be 3 months. I'm going to stick it out long enough that I can look at myself and say, I said I was going to do this and I did.
Yeah.
Because you need to
Yes.
trust yourself. So if you felt like it
Mm.
was a good decision to do it at the
Yeah.
time, then you want to see it through because you want to be able to trust yourself that when you say you're going to do something, you're going to do it.
Mm.
There are sometimes extenuating circumstances, but sometimes we just need to persist. And the other
Yes.
thing that I would say is use this S curve, use this way to talk yourself through, to say to yourself, you know what? It is true that maybe this is not a good decision, but right now, I just don't have enough data. So I need to just stick with it a little bit longer. And yes, I am uncomfortable, but I will tell you, I had Seth Godin on the podcast a year or so ago, and he said to me, Whitney, when you feel like an imposter and you feel like you
Mhm.
can't do it, good. Why? because you're doing something new. And when you're doing something new, you feel alive and we want to
Yes.
grow. Growth is our default setting. So stay with it until it feels a little bit easier and then change, but don't change immediately. Don't give up immediately.
Yeah, stay with it a little bit longer. I love that idea.
Mhm.
Being uncomfortable is a good thing. Set
Mhm.
a time parameter around it and yeah, and do it. Give yourself that opportunity. It does build confidence, right? Even if
Mhm.
eventually you decide it's not for you and you are going to jump onto another S curve, a different
Mhm.
place, different adventure, it gives you confidence to know that you did put that time frame and you tried it, right? I
Mhm.
love it.
A
Isn't
little
it
bit longer.
yeah, and I love this S-curve concept because it can apply to our careers, our jobs,
Mhm.
our positions, learning a language, living abroad, so many ways in which we now have a tool that we can know where we are in the progression of learning things and
Yeah.
adapting. I love it.
Mhm.
So I want to remind our listeners, guys, don't forget this is part one in a two-part series about disrupting ourselves. So Whitney, you are going to be over on Matt Abraham's podcast,
Yes.
Think Fast, Talk Smart in the near future to
Yeah.
kind of explore disrupting ourselves from a different angle. Isn't that right?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I'm looking
Excellent.
forward to it.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. I want to encourage you guys to go over and check out that podcast. But any final words of wisdom for our listeners, Whitney, before we finish up? Anything our listeners
Mm,
should keep in mind?
yeah, I would say the older we get, the more insulated the more we can insulate ourselves from ever doing something new. And
Yes.
so keep that muscle strong. Keep it
Mm,
strong. Do new things. Do things that scare you a little bit. And it might be moving to a new country. It might be moving to a new city. It might be um, doing something that just feels a little bit uncomfortable and you want to back out of it. Just do it anyway, because the more you can develop that muscle of doing new things, and the S curve can help you walk through it, the more you're going to make progress. And when you make progress, because we were wired to grow, then the more
mm.
progress you can make. And when you're making progress, you're happy.
Yes.
So do
That's where
new
happiness.
things.
Oh, I love that. I needed to hear that as well. Wonderful. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Whitney, for being on the show. Very inspirational episode for us today. And we hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you so much. Have a good one. Bye.